కానీ ఇక్కడ థర్డ్ స్లైడ్ ఎక్కడో కనిపిస్తుంది సార్, మాకు వేరే స్లైడ్ కనిపిస్తుంది.
ఏమో మరి ఇక్కడికైతే వచ్చేసాను నేను ఇప్పుడు. ఓకే, ఒక్క నిమిషం ఆగండి. అయితే ఇదైతే నాకైతే నా స్క్రీన్ మీద ఫస్ట్ స్లైడే ఉంది. టైటిల్ను నా పేరును కిందని అది రావట్లేదా మీకు?
రావట్లేదు సార్.
ఓకే, ఇట్ లుక్స్ లైక్ దెర్ ఇస్ సమ్.
నౌ ఇస్ ఓకే, నౌ సార్ వస్తుంది, అలాగే ఉండండి సార్.
అలాగే, కానీ ఇది ఫుల్ స్క్రీన్ కాదు ఇది.
సార్ ఇక్కడ నీట్ గా కనిపిస్తుంది సార్ మాకు.
ఓకే, ఇక్కడ పెట్టనా ఇప్పుడు?
ఫుల్ స్క్రీన్ కాదు సార్, కనిపిస్తుంది. గుడ్ మార్నింగ్.
చేశానండి ఇప్పుడు.
ఉంది సార్, ఇక్కడ ఉంది సార్.
ఇప్పుడు ఫుల్ స్క్రీన్ వచ్చింది కదా.
To all the participants, we have a next lecture by Dr. Srinivas Chokkakula. He is a scientist in and research chief in water conflicts and governance in the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. He has been working on for a long time on governance, policy making on transboundary water disputes and conflicts, and policy making drafts and reports. And now we have an opportunity and privilege to hear, learn something from. Till now we have discussed only the technicalities of the water management. Now this lecture will take you to the governance and policy making matters. I think this also will help the researchers how the policies and be done using for the water conflicts. Now I request Dr. Srinivas garu, please go ahead with your talk.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Good morning, everyone. This is a bit of a tough platform to engage with because I can only see my PowerPoint presentation in front of me. I don't see anyone. So you will have to bear with me if there are any glitches or otherwise, any goof-ups. But I hope that the background on the backstage, people would caution me about any goof-ups that I might be doing. But first of all, let me just make sure that this audio is clear, right? Can I get some feedback about the audio? Okay, I assume that you can't speak to me. So I'm going to go ahead right now. So first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Muni Reddy and his colleagues for having me here to speak with you and share my work. You know, it's always such a pleasure to come back to your own place and share your work. You know, it's just unbeatable. So I'm so pleased to be here. Though I would have liked to see you in person and talk to you about this work. Well, I was also told that you have had a 4 days long grueling webinar sessions. So I hope that this policy discussion would give you a kind of welcome break from all those technical presentations that you have been, attending. I mean, this is something that from the designation that is there on the screen, you might make out that I work on transboundary water conflicts, which is both international as well as interstate. And I specialize on that topic. It is in that context that we started looking at the larger problem of federal governance, because recently we have written a report for the World Bank, which was expected to inform the thinking of the 15th Finance Commission about approaching water sector governance. So we had a chance to look at much more closely at the larger federal governance framework, and then we realized that most of the work that we do must be embedded within, particularly on interstate river water disputes, must be embedded in the larger framework of the federal governance. And the federal governance should also be sort of extended to think beyond just disputes resolution. And it should be also looking at how we should address the larger issues of long-term water security, where climate change is going to become a very critical challenge. to address the longer term interests, water security interests of the nation. So I'll just I'll just show you how I'm going to go about my talk. What I want to do first is to introduce you to this India's perceived water crisis. If not, we may not agree with it, or we may disagree with it, but at least if you had been following the public discourse in the past 1 year at least, particularly the July 2019, you must have seen when the Niti Aayog had released their report on composite water management index, that is their second report. And then at the same time, simultaneously, we had a delayed monsoon. There was this major, concern about the emerging water crisis of India. And then I wanted to situate this talk in that water crisis, because we cannot really talk about just climate change as just a singular issue that needs to be addressed by the federal governance framework. The climate change itself is the new emerging governance challenge for India. And within that context, I would like to bring in the climate change aspect and then situate this in the larger India's water crisis. And then I talk about the federal governance for long-term water security. How are we positioned? And how is it that the center and states are working with each other in dealing with these emerging challenges of water governance and also the water crisis? And then in that, I actually propose that center, there seems to be a lost ground of the center to anchor the states towards dealing with these emerging governance challenges. And then I illustrate with some examples of the work that we have done on various aspects about how the federal politics of governance matters in policy making and how it poses different kinds of challenges altogether. And then I come to the point saying that, okay, if this is the way the federal politics play out, of water governance play out, how do we go about it? And I suggest that the center must thrive towards regaining its ground. And I say that actually though it is trying to do it, it is a bit feeble and fragmented and firefighting modes, but it needs to be a lot more consolidated, it needs to be a lot more comprehensive, and it needs to pursue it with a solid and definitive pathway towards change to address these challenges. So I'll get started with that introduction to India's water crisis. As I did say, the Niti Aayog report last year, I assume it is actually 2018, which we had. That report has triggered a major debate within the public space. And they have actually they have used CWC's data, Central Water Commission's data, to say that the demand in India will exceed 2 times the supply by 2030 itself. Now, these are things that one needs to look at a little bit closely to understand in what context it has been said. But in any case, some of you, most of the audience, I assume that you are a lot more familiar with these numbers. And there is also a simultaneous report that CGWB brings out, but I'm citing 2013 because that was the only data that was used so far. In the subsequent reports of the CGWB as well, which brings out every year. It's 32% of the groundwater units that are being monitored are in critical stage or above. And then there is CPCB, which is monitoring the pollution of rivers. And then 16 out of 40 rivers that are monitored in 82 locations are polluted. And then this is something that you know of because Andhra Pradesh happens to be one of the downstream states, and then there is an increasing and intractable interstate river water disputes. And you may be knowing it familiar because recently there's been a coverage about, not I wouldn't say escalation, but at least there is an emergence of dispute between Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, which are upstream and downstream states. So these are increasingly becoming an issue because of the competition over water resources. And then there is a lot more alarming report that has recently come out last year by the World Bank, and they talk about how the Green Revolution has has polluted, the Green Revolution inputs have polluted water resources, primarily the nitrate pollution, nitrate content in groundwater. That is actually affecting adversely the human productivity within India. So the whole idea of the slide is to give you a sense of the kind of crisis that is emerging at the national level. Now we can look at it, we have a choice to look at it as this outcomes, as a cumulative impact of all the states together, because states pursue their water resources development strategies within their territory, and then at the national level you see it as a kind of cumulative impact. But is that all, is the question that we need to ask, because there is a much larger, there is the way this phrase goes about the whole is some of its parts. Is it really some of its parts, or otherwise there are much larger issues of national long-term water security that is involved? And I'll just talk about it a little bit more briefly before we get into the real issue. There are, besides the crisis, as I did say, that there are emerging challenges of water governance, and as you know, and this is something that you are talking about, climate change is the emerging challenge of water governance. It is a big unknown. And why I say that it is a big unknown is because I'll just briefly elaborate on it in the next slide. But climate change is a bigger issue that needs to be dealt with at a national level. As you know, subnational or otherwise local level, yes, there is some action necessary, but it is also important and a lot more critical that this action for addressing climate change has to be positioned at the national level. And then there are these floods and disasters who do not see the territorial boundaries or administrative boundaries that we have drawn. These cut across these boundaries of the states, and that there is a certain kind of coherent response that is needed. And as you know, the National Mission for Clean Ganga has highlighted how important one of the largest rivers of India needs to be treated, and they have highlighted it. Hello?
Sir, slides, you need to change the slides.
Well, I am changing those slides. I think the slideshow is not working because I could make out last time also you had trouble. Maybe I should get out of this slideshow and I'll just use it as a bigger screen. Is that okay?
Yes.
Can you see this now? Yeah, when I'm shifting it in the slides, yeah.
Now, when I'm please continue with this mode. Please continue with the same.
Okay, I'll do that. So yes, sir, I'm talking about, in fact, just to quick you, if you haven't seen it, then this is the previous slide about India's water crisis. And then the next slide, this is about India's emerging challenges. And I did, as I was trying to say, I talked about climate change as the bigger challenge that needs response at a national level with the support of the states, and then also floods and disasters which cut across boundaries. And then the river pollution as well as aquifer depletion. Also, as you may have seen, the Ganges. It requires more than one state's response, and the center has to work with the states to respond to deal with the issue of rejuvenation of River Ganga. And then there is this emerging issue of dam safety. As you know, we have built several dams at certain point of time, and now the dams are aging, and that needs to be responded. And then we are also growing, as you can see, the settlements are growing. There are major urban centers coming out as mega cities. As you can see right now, the requirements of, cities like Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, Kolkata, these mega cities is becoming increasingly important, including Chennai. As you may have seen recently, the Kaveri dispute decision that is given by the Supreme Court made an exclusive allocation to Bangalore drinking water supply. That is the kind of importance that is emerging. Now, in order to deal with it, yes, while there is a need for a national level response, but it is also important to appreciate the fact that the states are key participants, and you need to work with these participants towards ensuring the longer term national water security. Now, as I did say that I would like to talk briefly about this climate change and water resources. And why I call it as a big unknown is because it is both uncertain as well as unknown. I mean, even though it has been recognized that the water resources, hydrological regimes would be affected by the climate change, there isn't much that we haven't done. I'm sure you're familiar with this seminal paper where the stationarity principle that we use as civil engineers is no longer valid by Millie and others in 2008, which has become an important paper that has been cited extensively. The point is that the envelope that we assume as like 75 years probability or 100 years probability rainfall, the envelope that we use as a kind of metric that can be assumed as that you would have similar pattern is no longer valid, and it is disrupted both spatially as well as temporally, and that is the point that this paper makes. And then the recent most paper, recent most status report that is released by UNESCO and UN Water in 2020 actually says it very clearly about the challenge that is involved when it comes to dealing with climate change and water resources, is that there will be increasing frequency and magnitude of extreme events that you can see as floods and that you can see as various kinds of disasters. Now, it says in its own words, and I quote here, which is that despite the mounting evidence that climate change is affecting the global hydrological cycle, much uncertainty remains when projecting its impacts over smaller geographical and temporal scales. So if you want to take action, there is very little research that is done, and there is very little understanding that is available to inform practice of water governance. If you want to say that there is a need for responding to climate change, that is because I don't think we have adequately invested in the research to understand how the climate change would affect the hydrological cycles and regimes within at a local scale or otherwise at a basin scale. There is some bits of work that is coming out from different institutions, but you don't see, I wouldn't question the credibility, but you don't see definitive outputs that are coming out, knowledge products that are coming out from federal agencies or institutions that can tell you about the impacts at the lower level. At least that's how I see. So that itself is an issue that we need to be concerned about, that we don't have adequate understanding of the impacts at the lower scale that can inform action is a bigger challenge that we need to deal with when it comes to climate change. Now, these spatial and temporal uncertainties that are produced by the climate change, they require certain level of coherent and coordinated response. As you have seen it, they cut across, most of these challenges cut across the territorial boundaries of the states, and there is a need for national level response for the states to work with together and then pursue this problem. Now, while these are the challenges that we are facing, at the same time, the country has set itself ambitious developmental goals, which also require a kind of action which is interstate in nature, an action that is necessary at the national scale, not at the subnational scale. And it actually, these developmental goals and the plans themselves highlight the fact that the future plans for water resources development and management lie in interstate domain itself. So you can actually see, visualize an increasingly interdependent hydrology and hydrodynamics that needs to be dealt with. You take any plans that we have at the national scale, like river rejuvenation, Ganga rejuvenation. And I have always argued that one of the challenges and one of the biggest blind spots for Indian national policy making is how to bring in the stakeholder states on board to work with the National Mission for Clean Ganga to produce enduring and lasting solutions of river rejuvenation. And then if you take inland navigation, it is quite obvious that it requires interstate coordination. It requires coordination across the states and at a national level. And then interlinking or interbasin transfer is something that, though much contested, is also because of the problems of interstate coordination, it has not taken off. And even the larger goal of more acceptable goal of shifting to integrated water resources management also requires a kind of national level drive to pursue this. And as you know, recent missions like Jal Jeevan Mission to provide access to safe and reliable water supply to rural Communities also require mobilizing water resources across boundaries. So if you look at this, on one side, there is this crisis conditions and the emerging challenging conditions, and then the kind of ambitious development plans that we have set. Are we prepared for it? Are we ready for it? Do we have the larger policy and institutional framework to deal with? Let's just dive into that at this moment and to deal with it. I'm keeping this whole idea in this mind at the back of our mind. Are we ready for it? Now, how do we position ourselves? How do we position ourselves in dealing with it? As I did mention, that states are the key stakeholders. The reason why it is the case is that water is a state subject. That is how it is at least assumed as well as presumed. And it is also practiced as that water is the state subject. As you know, under the 7th schedule, there is a federal reorganization, a federal organization of powers tell you that within the state list, the entry 17 talks about water as water supply, irrigation, drainage, and storage. But then this entry 17 is actually subject to entry 56 of the union list. And how did we practice it? How did we bring it into play? And to the extent the entry 56, which is dealing with interstate river regulation and development, is primarily focused on disputes resolution, which is about not even using the entry 56. We have got Article 262, which is a specific article within the Constitution that talks about interstate river water disputes resolution. And very often you see the center's role primarily restricted to disputes resolution, and beyond, of course, making certain kind of centrally sponsored schemes central and other kind of financial transfers. You do not see the center playing a major proactive role in shaping the way we pursue our water resources management practices. It is primarily restricted to interstate river water disputes resolution. Alongside, there is also this, in response to that entry 56, we have enacted a legislation called River Boards Act 1956. I'll talk about it because in any case, you don't see much about how this act is being used, but I'll talk about it. But my argument is that because of this lack of coherent coordination by the center across the states, it seems there is at a federal level, there is a kind of tragedy of commons. I mean, those people who are familiar with the literature on common property resources would know what I mean by when I say tragedy of commons, is that when the resources are managed as common property resources, you end up with tragedy outcomes, or otherwise, suboptimal outcomes is the bigger theory that you have in social sciences. But if that is the case, and if that seems to be the situation, because we are, with the kind of representation are given by the water crisis conditions that I have shared with you, what about India's long-term water security, and what kind of role that the center has to play? So, and then, if this is the bigger question, now let us also look at when it comes to, because that is the topic that I want to engage with, is that federal governance, that should the center be playing only this role? Is that all? And if it is the case, why should it be the case that is the only role that the center has to play? And if it is not the case that it has to play much bigger role, and yet it is playing only smaller role, I mean, the kind of restricted role, how do we explain this? Now, that's the core question of interest of my presentation here. So when I say, and I did say that actually, because that if we agree, I assume that I have convinced you enough that the center has to play a much bigger role and should not let the states to pursue their own, strategies where at the national level you have suboptimal outcomes and you don't see outcomes that reassure you about long-term water security. How do we explain this state of affairs right now, that the center is only playing limited role? Let me just share with you about, and I called it as center's lost ground. And let me share why this center's lost ground has happened and what were the reasons for it. And I mean, this is a kind of hypothesis, but you might call it, but I think, I mean, I hope that I would be able to make a compelling argument at the end of this, is that, you know, if you look at the political, what I call as the political geographic genetic code of India, when on the left side, you would see those territorial entities, the spread of territorial entities before 1947, which is actually in 1941. And as you can see, the pink color, if you can make out the way it is coming out on your screens, are those British ruled territories. And the yellow are the princely states. And as you can see, they are substantial stakeholders. And what you see now is the 29 states that we have right now. And that's the kind of genetic code that determines the kind of politics and the kind of agreements that we would have about managing resources. Very often this aspect, this dimension is not adequately explored. But let me just explain why I stress this point is because most of the way the union, the constitution is structured, and the way union and states position themselves are an outcome of a compromising solution that came out of negotiations before the independence. You know, there are these centrifugal forces that where princely states wanted to become sovereign states and they have their own aspirations. They also, some of them also wanted to separate from Indian, or otherwise they want to be independent of the Indian Union that was proposed at that time. And there are these centripetal forces. There are this social movement that was binding across the princely states and presidencies. And then there are this Indian Federation itself is interested in putting this union together. So these social forces worked out a kind of compromise where they agreed on, very importantly, which is most relevant here for this talk, is the kind of federal organization of powers and responsibilities. So what you saw as Enter 17, which actually gave this assumption that water is a state subject, or otherwise Enter 56, the interstate river regulation has to be union subject. These are all came out of these negotiations. We need to recognize that part. And initially, as you know, India has started off as a more a unitary state, and then increasingly it has become a kind of federalizing, a federal nation. It is a federation. I mean, these are some of the examples that I used to show how India is increasingly becoming federal. You know, as you can see, this is the number of times Krishna dispute has become an issue of public interest since the independence till recently, till 2004. And as you can see, the states are becoming more and more assertive. They're talking about their own interests. They're trying to compete with other states about their own allocations within the rivers. And that is the result of it, that you can see the kind of very frequently recurring issue around Krishna waters. And that itself is a reflection of how the states are asserting themselves, and they are positioning themselves as the regional powers. And I have much bigger argument to talk about, which may not be of interest at this moment, but just to give you a sense of how the federalizing has begun and how the center has started as a unitary state with a single party dominance. As you can see in the, just below there is a, what you call a kind of matrix, which maps the political governments at the center level and at in the different riparian states, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, and Maharashtra. As you can see, it's all blue. It's because it's all dominated by Congress. It's only after or otherwise early 1980s that you see that the configurations getting, changed. I mean, as you can see, by 1984, we have had, Andhra Pradesh has had Telugu Desam. And then in other states as well, you see the regional powers coming out. And it's a clear inflection point where now India, which was dominated by a single party, has becoming more and more federal by asserting their own regional identities and their regional powers. That was the idea. Now, in this whole process, what is lost, what I call is the center's lost ground. Let me come to that point. And this is not something that I am saying it, and I'm building on other scholars who are saying it. There is quite most of you who were interested in interstate river water disputes must have probably the most consistent writer and most prolific writer is Ramaswamy Iyer, who has said that there seems to be a willful abdication of its role by the center when it comes to water governance. And it's a kind of definitive statement that was made, which was accepted by several scholars. And I try to sort of explain this in the kind of abdication of role. The way I explain is, which is actually what I showed you early in the earlier slide, is that, during this phase of single party dominance, we had this, there was this negligence of solid, consolidated institutional framework for federal water governance. So you don't see, you don't find, if that phase itself has neglected creating the institutional practices and institutions themselves to deal with the kind of challenges that we are seeing right now. It is because of this, as you can see, it was just restricted to creating a dispute resolution mechanism through Interstate River Water Disputes Act 1956, and another, which is River Boards Act. We will talk about it, which is hardly used. It has remained defunct. So over a period of that single party dominance, this federal governance, institutional governance mechanisms were neglected. And then over the period of states asserting their identities and their positions, they started dominating the water governance. And then as a result of it, that vacuum has been filled by states' assertion itself. You don't have a chance to, and they took advantage of the vacuum that was created in the first phase of negligence of federal water governance. It is because of that that the states continue to, it is because of the states' assertion during that period of time and taking over, what I would call usurping of that space of federal governance by the states themselves, that we see these conditions of crisis and absence of coordination at the national level in governance. So this is what I call as the lost ground, and there is a need for the states to cede some ground, because there is a much bigger issue of national long-term water security goals that need to be addressed by the center. And then, it's interestingly, we have a single party dominance at this moment. Is it an opportunity, or is it not such a big opportunity to reclaim that space so that the center can work with the states to address the larger issues, is something that is open at the moment. Just to sort of reiterate or reinforce that argument about how the center has lost its ground, we have had, as I did tell you, that we have had a chance to look at it much more closely. This is a kind of illustrative example. This is how the center's water resources management allocations across the 5-year plans has changed. As you can see, it has decreased when it comes to center's allocations. At the same time, if you take the example of Maharashtra, which is the distinction of having the largest number of large dams in India, it has increased exponentially, as you can see. Now, that is the kind of shift that has taken place over time, and that is something that explains the lost ground of the center. Now, if you look at it, and I did tell you that we will come back to it, is that the center is primarily restricted to resolving interstate river water disputes, and then they have this Entry 56 driven River Boards Act 1956. It draws the force of Entry 56 within the union list to create that River Boards Act 1956, and not many people are aware of it, that this is such an act that is in disuse, that not a single board that you see is constituted using this act. None of the boards that you see. I mean, as you know, the Godavari River Management Board and the Krishna River Management Board, which are a lot more closer to us and proximate to us, they draw their force from the Andhra Pradesh Reorganization Act, not the River Boards Act 1956. And it is the similar case with any other river boards that you see in the entire country. Now, the question that remains is that the sole space for the center in the organization of, in governance of water resources is exerted or used using the Entry 56, using the River Boards Act 1956, and we don't use it at all. We don't even make attempt to modify it to suit the requirements. Now that itself tells you how it is neglected. The center has neglected its role in playing the role that it is supposed to play. Now, we can discuss this at length if you want to, but then obviously that's not the focus at the moment. But there is also another entry that is relevant to water, which is about inland waterways. But as you know, there is only authority that is constituted. It is not very active, and it is trying to become active by declaring about 105 waterways as inland waterways in the recent. I think it was in 2016. This act was, yes, the National Waterways Act 2016 declared 105 waterways in India as national waterways. But as you know, when the center, the authority that was created, when they started getting out of their job, they realized that it is so much dependent on the state's support, because the states have occupied the entire executive power, space for water governance. Now that is the way center is located. That is how weak it is located. However, there is also other ways. It's not just about those acts and the provisions that are provided within the Constitution that are relevant to directly for water. Water, as you know, cuts across all the sectors, and these sectors, one can use these provisions that are there within the government or otherwise through the acts of the parliament. I mean, the examples that I have listed down here is Article 252, where the states have empowered to come out with Water Act and Environment Act. These are, and then there is Disaster Management Act. These provisions could be used for water governance, but these are not necessarily. But the whole point is that when we want to map the center's influence, or otherwise the space, the scope for federal governance, we don't need to restrict ourselves to only those provisions that are relevant to water. It can extend beyond, where water is is a critical component for other sectors as well. Now, that is what I wanted to see, is that while you can see that the center is actually feebly located and it is very weak, but you can also see that there is a large potential for the center to work with the states to deal with these challenges. Now, we did say that you just should not be looking at only the legal instruments, but should also be looking at the institutional instruments. As you know, Central Water Commission has led, along with the other institutions, has led the Green Revolution, India's Green Revolution. But as you can see now, it is increasingly becoming, or at least the states are increasingly looking at it as irrelevant for them. The states are more pursuing their own strategies, and very often I argue that the state's water resources management is driven by 3 C's: the context of their states, the conditions of their states, historical conditions and other conditions, and then also the constituencies. I mean, they are driven by politics. Now, that's a kind of diversion, but the point is, if you look at this federal institutions like Central Water Commission, Central Groundwater Board, or National Institute of Hydrology kind of research institutions, I mean, for those people who are working within the government would know how frequently do they go to these institutions for their water resources management. I wouldn't blame the states for not going there, because I would also blame, at the same time, the blame need to be shared by these central institutions, which have led India's, food revolution towards achieving the food security, losing their relevance. It is also because of their own problems in changing their own agendas. For example, how much of work that you see relevant to climate change coming out of these institutions? I mean, you don't see much, except that we rely on more other institutions, other research institutions' outputs. Now, that is the kind of similar, that weakening of the federal institutions is also happening at the same time. I mean, as a result of the weakening of these federal institutions, what is happening is that it is becoming, quite a bit legal oriented. Very often, civil society actors draw on the judicial institutions to bring in change. For example, the Supreme Court has to come in all the time to deal with some of these issues. Like NGT had to insist on creating Central Groundwater Authority, and that is when it was created. And it's similar way when it comes to some of those examples in the recent times, like Maharashtra Water Resources Regulatory Authority. They had to go, they needed support of Supreme Court to pursue their own, interventions to make sure that their interventions are effective. Now, as you can see, I mean, if you look at the larger, broader canvas, the center is now in the spree of creating, for example, like Kaveri Water Management Authority, or otherwise National Ganga Rejuvenation Board Authority, River Board, River Basin Management Authority. Now, how often do you see these authorities becoming effective? How often do you see the states that are relevant are complying with these authorities directives? That itself shows you how center and states are working with each other in pursuing the larger goals of the nation. Now, I wanted to share with you some of these examples of how the federal politics are playing out in different examples. I'll probably should have to run this fast because I think I'm already at 11:43, so probably I don't have much time. I think it is. I mean, unless you correct me, I think I do have time till 12. So I'll try to run it through. So I'll just give you an example, a sense of how these federal politics are working against each other in producing suboptimal outcomes. I mean, at different scales. I mean, this is something that I've been working. I have worked earlier, so I thought I would share with you. The most reflective of the federal politics is using obviously the interstate federal politics and governance of water sources within India is by using the interstate river water disputes. And this cartoon is my favorite when it comes to communicating how different forces work against each other. And very often, and very visceral and instinctive response to this kind of representation is that, yeah, I know that's the biggest problem with the politics. Now, the issue is the biggest, it is also, while it is the problem, it is a problem. It is also a big trap that most of our scientists have, is that while if it is that important parameter, politics is that important parameter, why don't we consider how do the politics play out in our own design of institutions, in our own design of policies? Now, that is the kind of trap that we get into by saying that it is something that is unavoidable. I mean, the visceral rejection of this idea of politics is itself is weakening our own thinking and our own design of policies and institutions, is what I wanted to argue here. So, and this is something that is not specific to India, or that is not something that you can say that associated with negatively with Indian politics. You see, as a federal entity, this is only natural. As there is a very famous citation. I am sorry I didn't put the citation here, but a very famous constitutional thinker called A.V. Dicey, who said that if you want a federation, which is what we wanted to, Federal Republic of India, and if that is the one which defines it, we must realize that a federation must desire union, is living together, but it doesn't mean that there should be unity on everything. Must desire union, but must not desire unity. That's a very, encapsulated way of representing how the politics work within a federal institution, because the federation, the idea of very federation itself is to provide space for identity and diversity. And if you want to, the reason why you wanted to give that space, and that is the reason why you wanted to go for a federal constitution, if that is the case, that is bound to have disagreements, that is bound to have differences, that is bound to have competition that is defining politics. And that is precisely the reason why you need to have distributed organization of legislative powers and governance. And it is because of that that you see these social forces working against each other. And that is always, when it comes to federal democracy, it is all about compromising across different social forces. And that is all. You see, obviously, political leaders are accountable to their own constituencies, and there is a much larger goal that they have to work around with. So the point that we can talk about it, but then I wanted to drive out is that it is only natural that you see these social forces working against each other, and you need to work around, be conscious about it, and you need to work around with these two in designing more enduring policies and institutions. Now, this is a bigger challenge when it comes to, and I'll just give you 2-3 examples about how it is a challenge. And I'll be a little brief here because I think we don't have much time here. But you see, this is the most. I'll tell you, the most celebrated instance of interstate cooperation is the Telugu Ganga, which is actually close to us, Andhra Pradesh. And the most distinctive part is that three riparian nations have agreed to give some portion of water to a non-riparian nation. Nation. I mean, three riparian states have agreed to give some portion of their share to a non-riparian state. That too for Chennai's drinking water supply. And I did publish a paper on it, and you can look at it. And I trace the politics that has led to this possibility of such an increase, such a competitive world, and they have agreed to forego 5 TMC of each of their share, and it is continuing. And what many people do not while they celebrate it, but they don't know the fact that actually this agreement was signed during the period of emergency. Not many people are aware of it, that the the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi has got these riparian states to agree to share their water because she wanted to address a possible civic unrest because of the DMK government dismissal within Tamil Nadu. She wanted to show that actually I'm finally getting that proposed water from Krishna waters to you to deal with your drinking water needs. But this is a much larger story. The point that I'm trying to make is that this is how the federal politics matter in making or shaping interstate coordination. Now, you can go and look at this. You can read it and you can write to me if you want a copy of the paper. But you see, the next one I wish I had a slideshow on, but there is a good animation here, but that's not going to work now. But this is how the Kosi floods in 2008 happened. This is one of probably the most devastating of the floods. And there was a breach on the India-Nepal border here, and it has flooded the entire place here, and then it led to several deaths as well as loss of property. And in this work, we actually looked at a little bit of this national and subnational politics, and we came out with how important these politics are. And actually, this is an attempt to map the flood instances across how the political relations between India and Nepal are. And 2008 happens to be here every time, and this is Nepal's political, how the politics are positioned within Nepal and how the politics are positioned within India. While India has a stable government and stable democracy, fairly well-functioning democracy, Nepal has had several of these changes and very unstable. And every time there was an unstable government in Nepal, you had this breakdown of transboundary institutions. And that is what has happened in 2008. There is adequate evidence to show that it was just after the Maoists took over a Nepal government that this incident has occurred. And this is only to illustrate how politics matter, and they should make, and we need to recognize them in thinking the interstate or transboundary governance. And we have also sort of analyzed the national, subnational, and local politics that perhaps may be a little too much for the moment. But the point that I'm trying to divert is that, you see, one of the things that are more relevant here is that there is a kind of subnational federal politics that also mattered within Bihar. The reason why, the barrage that was breached is only a stopgap arrangement to deal with floods in Bihar from floods in Kosi Basin. And it is supposed to be supported by a much bigger high dam within the Nepalese territory. And that did not happen. That high dam was not built. And one of the reasons that is often mentioned about is that the center and state could not work together to make it possible and to work with Nepal to make the high dam possible. But there are also the kind of resisting factors within Bihar that also resisted this idea of having another high dam, which doesn't necessarily require all the flood protection works that were growing during the interim. Like you have 315 kilometer length of embankments. that are created in the interim of 25 to 30 years since the barrage was created. And these are managed, and there is a massive amount of money that is flowing into managing these embankments. And that itself has become an embankment mafia that resisted any progressive action to deal with it, is one of the theories that has been. Now, those embankments that are created are no longer called embankments, they are called assets. And there is a kind of, recently there was an assignment for a consultant to create cozy embankment asset management systems. That is the way, that is the kind of capitalist forces, the nexus between politics and the capitalist forces that are resisting these progressive actions. And it is an important factor that needs to be considered when it comes to talking about center and state coordination. And perhaps a lot more, the third example is a lot more relevant for you, or something that you can perhaps relate. The Kerala floods that happened recently, how many people can say with confidence that it is a climate change phenomenon? I mean, there are papers, but they are not definitive enough to tell you that. And why is that? Because we don't have enough understanding, or we are not equipped to generate enough understanding. And I'll just illustrate it with this question, this about how this is a more a federal center state coordination that is important, that has led to, that is important when it comes to explaining these floods in Kerala. There were only 67 rainfall gauges, whereas the relevant code asks you for at least minimum 250 rainfall gauges to collect data and to explain this phenomenon. And that is how ill-equipped the federal institutions like IMD and even the Central Water Commission are there in supporting their state's own actions. And the Kerala state itself could be blamed, because one of the theories that is going around is that, you see, Kerala state electricity board is responsible for the dam operations, and this is something that has not been proved yet, but this is a hypothesis that came out in our own inquiry, is that Kerala State Electricity Board chose not to include adequate flood cushion in their designs of the dams. Now, the KSAB, the moment we fragment it, obviously it is interested in maximizing its electricity generation, and there is no incentive for it to keep those cushions. And one needs to look into it, and there is very little work that looks into this, conflicts between institutional agendas that is leading to this kind of outcomes. While we don't have enough technical, we are not adequately technically equipped to explain whether it is a climate change phenomenon at that scale. At the same time, our own institutions are not equipped to deal with it because of these disabilities that it actually shows. And our own, if you look at into dams, rule curves themselves, they are not adequately modified to deal with. Let us say it is because of the climate change. Are the state governments have enough understanding to change or otherwise to modify their rule curves and the necessary dam operation protocols to deal with this assumed climate change? That itself shows how important for the central and the state institutions, state water resources departments, and the federal institutions that are supposed to bring in knowledge input should be working together in dealing with the emerging challenges like climate change and floods and disasters. Now, I hope that these examples show you how important these are when it comes to going beyond technology, looking at institutions, looking at technological capacities, and looking at institutional processes that are to deal with the emerging challenges and crisis conditions. Now, if it is the case, and I think I'm running closer to 12, if it is the case, how do we regain this ground for the center? How can center reposition itself to work with the states? And I would say that it is not trying to do, because obviously they're trying to pursue these ambitious plans and they have to regain that ground. That is forcing them to regain ground. And I would say that this is not comprehensive enough. And this is what I describe as feeble, fragmented, and firefighting modes. And I say that because if you look at Composite Water Management Index by DTI, it is just a desperate attempt to show, how many times do you see states changing their water resources management strategies because they wanted to, have a better ranking, how sensible it is. So there is the incentive and disincentive structures for the center to work with the states in shaping their water resources management strategies to deal with the emerging challenges is not adequately thought through. So it's a very feeble, response to work with the states. Similarly, it's fragmented. While it is much, appreciated and much highlighted, the National Mission for Clean Ganga, why do we need to only focus on Ganga? Why can't, as you know, every river within our own region is our own Ganga. So why can't there be a comprehensive approach to deal with rejuvenating rivers and conserving rivers? Why should it be only focused on? Well, you might say that it is a pilot exercise, but can a river like Ganges would be a pilot exercise? And why can't it be a pilot exercise in a much more comprehensive approach policy towards rejuvenating and cleaning rivers within India? So that is how it is fragmented. And again, firefighting mode. As you know, the Kaveri Water Management Authority, those people who are following those interstate river water disputes would say that until and unless Supreme Court gave 2 weeks for the government to create this authority, it did not create it. And within 2 weeks, how much homework one can do and how much enduring institutions one can create. And the bigger question is, yes, you have created the Kaveri Water Management Authority. Can you be confident to say that the same template would work for, say, Andhra Telangana coordination or Krishna, Godavari, other kind of rivers which are interstate rivers? We can't be so sure. We can't be so definitive. And as you know, Kaveri Water Management Authority is already, it is contested by Karnataka as well as Kerala in the way their jurisdiction and their own operations were defined by those provisions. But, we will come to know these, how well it would work when there is another distress period, and we will have to, this institutional model itself will be tested, and we're all keen to look at how much we can learn when there is a distress. So if that is the way the center is trying to, regain the ground, I would argue, and I say that, and I've argued, is that you can't do it with these piecemeal responses. You can't do it with this feeble, fragmented, and firefighting modes, particularly given the kind of political history of losing the ground that we have. So what I propose is that the water agenda has to be elevated, and it is necessary for the center to work towards a new federal consensus about how do we deal with it? How do we deal with these crisis conditions? How do we deal with these emerging new challenges of water governance? And one needs to bring on them onto the table, and the center and states need to rework, saying that, okay, this is the kind of role that you will play, and this is the kind of role we will have to play. And it is not difficult to do it, given the fact that when it was the right moment, India has been able to achieve the kind of consensus that was needed for getting into GST reforms. And it is not difficult, or it is not impossible for the center, for the government to bring the states to table and talk about what kind of repositioning themselves is needed to deal with the larger challenges of water governance and to pursue the larger goal of long-term water security, including those challenges produced by posed by the climate change itself. So I think it is a need for repositioning itself and rethinking about how the constitutional provisions are interpreted and practiced. That requires certain kind of, quite a bit of deliberation between center and states. And in order to do that, and that is another bigger vacuum right now, is that there is no institutional space that can enable center and states to sit together and discuss about it. Of course, the finance ministry could make it possible to make the GST reforms possible, but water is a bigger challenge, I would say, because water resources, there is a certain kind of asymmetry, like Himalayan states would have a different priority to water resources compared to peninsular states, and their willingness to come to deliberation would be different. And there is also different kind of movements when it becomes very critical, when the distress periods, when the downstream states would be a lot more keen to set certain kind of agreements in place to address their interests, whereas the upstream states would not be so keen. So it requires a lot more. It requires a longer haul. It is a longer haul, and it requires much more longer deliberations for the center and states to rethink about their positions. And it can't be just simply restricted to interstate regulation and then rest of it water supply. It needs to be more functional. I mean, maybe the center can say that I will produce and bring in the state of the art understanding about, let us say, climate change itself and their own impacts at the different level, at the local level, and the states can use it to change their own strategies. That is the kind of one. There is a need for a federal consensus about their roles and responsibilities and powers of the center and states. And another, there is a continuous dialogue that is necessary. That kind of institutional space is needed. Now, it needs to, in order to do that, as I did say, this is the point that I was trying to, is that there is a need for carving out, instead of putting in a basket saying that this subject is yours, this subject is yours. There is a need for carving out functions, like as I did say, that knowledge generation, and then bringing in the state of the art understanding about these new challenges like climate change could be with center, because it can, the economics of scale would work in its favor. And it needs to anchor about the larger, it needs to anchor within the larger framework. While the states would be interested in their own immediate interests, the center has to reposition itself and reorient the states towards the larger national security goals. Now, when I say the center, and repeatedly that center has to regain, it doesn't mean that you need to create a stronger center. What I meant is that a stronger role for the center, which basically means stronger federal governance arrangements and less so the strong center, the way we used to have earlier. And it must not, it must, while it is important that it needs to reposition itself, we must not lose the, our focus on states themselves, because states continue to have the dominant executive power. States continue to respond to their constituencies much better, and they need to, their own institutions which are exercising that executive power need to change. For example, a very simple thing from supply augmentation mode, that is what all the water resources departments are geared for, to demand management. That itself is a major transition that needs to be driven, and with necessary support from the center and federal institutions. That is the kind of approach that we needs to take. If you want to pursue those larger reforms, then you need to be open to the idea of carving out functional roles. You need to focus more on strengthening the federal governance. You should not lose the sight that it is important to continue to focus on the states and their institutionalization of the change. With that, I thank you for your patience. I hope that we have enough time. It looks like I did cross by 5 minutes. Dr. Reddy, is this okay, or otherwise do you want to? Hello? Dr. Reddy?
today.
దయచేసి కొంత సమయం తర్వాత ప్రయత్నించండి. The number you're calling is out of network coverage area.
Yeah. Sir, Dr. Srinivas. Sir, Dr. Srinivas.
Yes, Dr. Reddy. I thought you all left. You got dozed off or
Thank you very much. Now, I think we'll wait for a few seconds. If somebody has a questions, they can
Okay.
write. There is
Yeah.
a question. Able to see on the screen?
Are you changing the slides? The only question that I have is that the slides about changing slides. I don't see any questions here. Live comments is what I need to see.
What
Yeah.
is the role of research in Jal Jeevan Mission? What is the role of research in Jal Jeevan Mission by Dr. Sridhar, hydrogeologist, TWD?
Well, I can't speak to it because I'm not part of the Jal Jeevan mission, though I am on the drafting committee for national water policy. And the task force chairman that was set up for Jal Jeevan mission happens to be part of the national water policy drafting committee. So we do exchange some notes. And I can say that, yes, there is no, I mean, they are trying to draw on the existing, that is limited knowledge. You must take it with, with some level of ignorance. In fact, you should say that. But my understanding is that they are very keen to learn from the existing efforts of the research, and they are involving and they have an extensive consultation mechanisms that are informing the Jal Jeevan mission guidelines. And they are building on existing research and understanding. Certainly, they are very keen and they are very open to that. So that is what at the most I can say at the moment.
Sir, there is a second question by Professor Srinivas Rao. Garu. What are the concerns towards the minimum environmental flows to be maintained in the rivers vis-a-vis allocation of river water to different states by river water boards? What are the concerns towards the minimum environmental flows to be maintained in the rivers?
Well, I am assuming that he meant constraints and not concerns. I mean, concerns are there. Yes, there are concerns, and that is the reason why there are recent notifications that talk about minimum environmental flows. But the constraints are about, yes, it is more about absence of robust and effective interstate river water coordination mechanisms. I would just leave it as mechanisms because it includes entire range of institutions to practices. So there are no, in fact, we don't even have an effective models. In fact, we just began with an exercise of learning from practices of interstate coordination at the moment. So I would put it at the top as the major constraint. You can write to me separately if you wish to know more. And I see there is another question here.
Yeah.
Demand for water is increasing day by day in India. How this demand can be mitigated? In fact, one of the immediate questions, this is a very bigger question than something that can be addressed right now. Demand itself can be mitigated by managing the demand itself. So, and I mean, perhaps I think it is more appropriate to give a more relevant response to this, is that I mentioned it about how the institutions for water resources management, primarily which is the subnational level, the state water resources departments, are primarily designed with the supply augmentation paradigm, with pursuing of supply augmentation, with building dams, with getting more and more water. These institutions are not equipped to promote demand management practices. So the biggest challenge that I would put in is that for the transition of these institutions to shift from supply augmentation paradigm to demand management paradigm. I'm not saying that it means abandoning the supply augmentation itself. It also means that they need to include demand management as part of their agenda and pursue it. So that is only one part of the response. It can also include the range of awareness campaigns to civic society actors' participation in bringing necessary change towards demand management. I hope that responds to your question. Any further questions? What is the role of research? No,
Few months ago,
okay.
NASA has reported 50% of the area of India will face severe water scarcity. What is your opinion?
I lost some part of it. What NASA has reported that? How much percentage is?
The area of India will face severe water scarcity.
Yes, these yes, I mean it may face, assuming that these projections are always what we call ceteris paribus, assuming certain conditions. And there are water scarce regions or locations, and that is why I am not entirely abandoning the supply augmentation paradigm, and I am not saying that we should abandon the entire paradigm, but we must accommodate enough space for the demand management to deal with this kind of emerging scarce conditions. But at the same time, we need to strive to bring in water resources to address this scarcity. I mean, there is possibility. I mean, we have always lived with all kinds of diverse conditions. Like, if you go to Thar into Rajasthan, it ranges from 100 mm rainfall to 400 mm rainfall. So there have always been conditions, and we did respond to them.
And there is another question. Would interlinking of rivers help or hinder water resource sharing? Your views. What is your opinion?
I'm not going to interlinking. You see, the biggest problem is that interlinking of rivers, the way it is framed, is the bigger problem. The problem is, as I did say, I did say that I'm not going to abandon entirely the supply argumentation. And I'm not saying that we must abandon. While we do move towards addressing the new challenges, we need to think about how much is feasible. That grand interlinking project that was proposed, and that is often has become the point of contention. As it is proposed, whether it is feasible any longer at all. And then within that, there are new sensibilities and new sensitivities and new concerns that are emerging, and how do we address them is the challenge right now. So I'm not someone who is a champion of a paradigm of interlinking or supply augmentation or demand management. I am somebody who is more into balancing various approaches to deal with the problem rather than becoming ideologically connected to one particular paradigm.
Sir, there is another question. Are there any policies which emphasize on water sensitive city, maybe part of some smart city? Are there any policies?
Yeah. There is, in fact, very often, if you look at the smart cities mission, a lot of these cities have proposed water related and water sensitive projects as part of their smart cities projects. There are plenty of experiences that we can actually build on. And for example, I think ranging from private sector participation to installing water meters, there is a whole range of experiences that we have, and they are part of it, and we need to build upon it towards that water sensitive smart cities. Are there any policies? Yeah, with emphasis on water sensitive city may be part of the smart city. I think it is already part of it. I wouldn't say that. There is another question that came up on the screen. We all understand, what is it? River Kosi is known as the sorrow of Bihar. Now, what are the steps being taken by nation and state? Well, there isn't any River Kosi. As I say, at this moment, everybody seems to prefer the status quo. And for whatever reasons that they have, I don't see, if you go to the solutions that come out, if you go to, they range across. If you go to the center, the nation, they would say that the initiative need to be taken by the state. and the state says that center doesn't take the necessary initiative to work with Nepal to create that high dam that would protect Bihar from that sorrow that you mentioned about. So the flood possibilities. And as you know, KL Rao happens to be the one who recommended this stopgap arrangement of barrage, and it has run out of its life already. In fact, the barrage is already filled with a huge amount of silt for some reason. And as I did say, one of the factors seems to be that there is a certain kind of social forces, nexus of social forces that is preventing any progressive action. But that is only one part of the problem. But there is also certain kind of stagnation out there between with no proper or otherwise adequate coordination between federal agencies and the state water resources department to pursue future actions, like whether it is high dam or some other kind of alternative that needs to be taken up.
Sir, can you see the question?
Yeah, research work is not project sponsored based. At many instances, then how the knowledge enhancement capacity building happening will be assimilated. Any policies for that by federal or state government? I think that is a very important, it is not project. I don't think I fully understand the question, but I think what I mean is that what you're asking about is that, is there enough resources, financial resources allocated for credible research? I think that is what you meant to say, and I would assume that and then respond to that. I think there is enough thinking that is happening at the national level. Recently, I think the previous budget session, the finance minister has proposed an agency for supporting research by consolidating across the sectors and departments, similar to the National Science Foundation within US. So that kind of, I mean, that announcement was made, and it is important that we should create special avenues and institutional avenues to support credible and critical research. And that was the intention of it, I assume, at least, because there is not much I have followed it up on that. But there is an effort to bring together, state-sponsored research addressing the immediate interests of the nation. That hopefully will shape into the kind of thinking that expectation that we have is the credible and critical research that could be supported by this foundation or whatever institution that is coming up. Any further questions? I don't see any other questions, unless, I mean, at least not on my screen.
It takes some few seconds to type the text and it should appear.
Okay. Okay. So I thought we were not, don't have enough time. Yeah, I see there is a question at 12:18. Average rainfall. Lot of background noise. So there is, the average rainfall is about 1193 millimeters. In spite of this huge rainfall, why we are thinking about now, I would call this a macro myopia. Very often we talk about this. We talk about these large numbers, average numbers. There's plenty of background noise, but there is, you see, this is the paradox of averages. If you take the entire national level average, it looks good, but if you don't take necessary action to deal with the condition, it's not going to help. So while there is 1193 or more than 1800 millimeters rainfall, there is also areas which is receiving less than 100 mm rainfall. So it is important. We should be talking about both surplus as well as scarcity.
Okay, sir. If there are no further questions, we need to.
There is a William Edwin who mentioned. You mentioned water is a CPR at federal level. I'm only hypothecating it, but I mean, it is, you can say, when I say CPR, it is common property resources. There is a plenty of literature about common property resource management. You can look it up. Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for joining us and sharing a totally new topic to us. Everybody was, looking at to learn something about the policies and water governments because we are all engineers. We'll be looking at the design
I've been an
schemes,
engineer.
modeling, but we are new to this policy matters and boundary and transboundary issues. And thank you very much for joining us. And we hope we'll be associating you further.
I look forward.
Charan, can you close the live? Charan, can you please close the live? Hello.